In the freezing North Atlantic waters of April 1912, a pregnant 18-year-old girl sat shivering in a lifeboat, watching the grandest ship ever built disappear beneath the waves. The screams of 1,500 people filled the darkness around her. The water was so cold that human bodies could only survive for minutes. Somewhere on that tilting deck, among the chaos and terror, stood her husband, the richest man in America, the wealthiest passenger on the most luxurious vessel ever to sail. And he was calmly smoking a cigarette as the ocean claimed him forever. His name was John Jacob Astor IV. His fortune was worth $87 million, the equivalent of nearly $3 billion today. He owned hotels that redefined luxury. He owned blocks of Manhattan real estate. He owned art collections and yachts and homes in multiple countries. And none of it, absolutely none of it, could buy him a seat in that lifeboat beside his terrified young wife. 4 months later, she would give birth to their son in a Fifth Avenue mansion so magnificent that 1,200 guests could dance in its ballroom without crowding. The ceilings were gilded with real gold. The staircases were carved from imported marble. The walls were covered in French Renaissance paneling that had taken craftsmen years to install. It was a palace fit for American royalty. And that mansion, like the unsinkable ship, like the unshakable fortune, was already doomed. Within 14 years, wrecking balls would reduce it to rubble. In one haunting photograph from that demolition, 2 small children sit playing in an abandoned marble bathtub amid the ruins. They are surrounded by broken stone and twisted metal. Behind them, you can see the skeleton of what was once the most exclusive address in New York. They had no idea they were sitting in the wreckage of American aristocracy. They did not know they were playing in the remains of a dynasty that had ruled this city for generations. This is the story of how a fortune worth billions in today's money drowned along with its heir, how a palace became a pile of debris, how the tragedy that unfolded on the Titanic was only the beginning of the end for the House of Astor. It is a story about the illusion of permanence, about the danger of believing that wealth makes you invincible, about the mansion that was supposed to last forever but barely survived a generation, and about the family that discovered, far too late, that all the money in the world cannot stop time from tearing everything down. The dynasty began with a German immigrant named John Jacob Astor, born in 1763 in the small village of Waldorf near Heidelberg. He was the youngest son of a butcher, growing up in a timber-framed house that still stands today. His prospects were limited. His family was poor. His future looked like his father's past. A life of hard work, low pay, no advancement. But John Jacob had something his brothers did not: ambition that bordered on obsession. At age 16, he left Germany and made his way to London, where his brother owned a musical instrument shop. He learned the business. He saved every penny. And in 1784, at age 21, he boarded a ship bound for America. The crossing took months. The conditions were brutal. But when that ship finally docked in Baltimore, John Jacob Astor stepped onto American soil with 7 flutes to sell and a determination to become rich. He started with fur. The beaver pelt trade was booming. European fashion demanded beaver skin hats, and America had an unlimited supply of beavers. Astor saw the opportunity immediately. While other traders worked as middlemen, he went directly to the trappers. He learned their language. He traveled into territories where few white men dared venture. He built relationships with Native American tribes who controlled the richest trapping grounds. And he bought furs at prices that left room for massive profits when he sold them in New York and Europe. Within a decade, he was wealthy. Within 2 decades, He was one of the richest merchants in New York. But John Jacob Astor understood something that many wealthy men did not. Furs were a business. Real estate was a legacy. Fashion could change. Fur could go out of style. But land, especially Manhattan land, would only become more valuable as the city grew. So he bought. Block after block, street after street. He bought farmland on the edges of the city, knowing that eventually the city would expand to meet it. He bought waterfront property that other investors considered worthless swampland. He bought at prices that made other merchants laugh at his foolishness. And then he waited, and rented, and collected income from every building on every piece of land he owned. His strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Buy land. Build the cheapest possible structures on it. Rent those structures for whatever the market would bear. Never sell. When the buildings wore out, tear them down and build new ones. But never ever sell the land itself. Let the city grow around you. Let property values rise. Let the rents increase year after year, and watch your fortune multiply while you sleep. When John Jacob Astor I died in 1848, his fortune of $20 million made him the richest man in America. Some historians estimate he was the fourth wealthiest person in history, adjusted for the economy of his time. In modern terms, that $20 million would be worth over $120 billion, more than most oil fortunes, more than tech billionaires, an almost incomprehensible amount of money, and almost all of it was in Manhattan real estate. He left behind more than money. He left behind a philosophy that would guide his descendants for generations. Real estate, he believed, was the only investment that would always have value. Cities would always grow. Populations would always increase. Land was finite. The demand would only go up. Build on it, rent it, never sell it. It was a formula so successful that his great-great-grandson would still be following it 64 years later when he boarded the Titanic. The Astor fortune passed to William Backhouse Astor, then to his son, William Backhouse Astor Jr. Each generation added to the empire. More buildings, more blocks, more rent. The family became landlords to half of Manhattan. They owned so much property that it was said a man could walk from the Battery to the Harlem River without ever leaving Astor land. They were richer than any family in America, and they learned to live like European royalty in a nation that claimed to have no kings. By the 1850s, the family needed a palace worthy of their status. The Astors could not simply be rich. They had to look rich, act rich, live in a way that made their wealth visible to everyone who mattered. In 1856, William Backhouse Astor Jr. received a wedding gift from his father that would change New York society forever. A mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue, at 34th Street, right where the Empire State Building stands today. It was a modest brownstone by later standards, just 50 feet wide and 107 feet deep. 4 stories tall, built in the Italianate style that was fashionable at the time. But it stood on what was then the northern edge of respectable New York, on former Astor farmland that was rapidly transforming into the most expensive real estate in America. Fifth Avenue was becoming the address for anyone who wanted to matter. William's wife, Caroline Schermerhorn, was not content with modest anything. Born in 1830 to one of New York's oldest Dutch families, the Schermerhorns traced their lineage back to the city's founding. They had money, but more importantly, they had lineage. They had respectability. They had the kind of old-world pedigree that new money could never buy. Caroline believed, from the moment she married into the Astor family, that she was destined to rule New York society itself. And from that brownstone fortress on Fifth Avenue, she did exactly that. She became known as the Mrs. Astor. Not an Mrs. Astor. Not one of the Mrs. Astors. The Mrs. Astor. The definite article was crucial. It meant there was no one else who mattered. There were other wealthy women in New York. Other society hostesses. Other families with old money and grand homes. But Caroline Astor was the Mrs. Astor. And that title carried weight that mere wealth could not convey. With the help of social arbiter Ward McAllister, a Southern gentleman who made a career out of defining who belonged in society and who did not, Caroline created something that would define New York's elite for a generation. The 400. A list of the only people in New York who truly counted. The number, according to legend, was chosen because Caroline's ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue could only hold 400 guests comfortably. If your name was on that list, you existed. If your name was not on that list, you were nobody, no matter how much money you had. The criteria for inclusion were mysterious and entirely at Caroline's discretion. Old money helped, but it was not enough. The Livingstons and Van Rensselaers, families who had ruled New York society for generations, were assured places. But new money from railroads and steel and oil? That required scrutiny. You needed the right breeding, the right manners, the right connections. You needed to have attended the right schools, married into the right families. Most importantly, you needed to convince Caroline Astor that you deserved a place in her world. She held court in that ballroom every Monday night during the social season, which ran from November through Lent. The routine never varied. She wore the same diamond tiara to every event. She sat in the same chair, elevated slightly above her guests. She received visitors with the same icy perfection, offering a nod of acknowledgement to those she approved of, and a glacial stare to those she did not. Generals, senators, even presidents sought invitations to her dinners. European aristocrats visiting America made appointments to be presented to her. To be received by Mrs. Astor was to have arrived in society. To be snubbed by Mrs. Astor was social extinction. She created a world with rules so strict that even the wealthiest families lived in fear of making a mistake. You did not arrive at a party too early or too late. You wore the right clothes. You knew which fork to use for which course. You understood the unspoken hierarchy of who sat where at dinner. You never, ever discussed money in polite company. And you certainly never questioned Mrs. Astor's judgment about who belonged and who did not. The Vanderbilts, despite being richer than the Astors, were initially excluded. Alva Vanderbilt had to throw the most spectacular costume ball in New York history just to force Caroline to acknowledge her existence. The robber barons who were building America's railroads and industries found their money meant nothing without Caroline's approval. Fortunes that could build cities could not buy a seat at Mrs. Astor's dinner table unless she decided you were worthy. For nearly 40 years, Caroline Astor ruled New York society with absolute authority. She was queen of a social order that she had created and maintained through sheer force of will. Her ballroom was her throne room. Her Monday receptions were her court. And every person who mattered in New York knew that their place in society depended on her favor. But even queens face challenges to their thrones. And for Caroline Astor, the challenge came from within her own family. In 1893, her nephew by marriage, William Waldorf Astor, decided to wage a war that would force Caroline to abandon her beloved home. William Waldorf was the son of John Jacob Astor III, which made him Caroline's nephew through her husband's family. He was monumentally wealthy, having inherited a fortune estimated at $100 million. But he had never been fully accepted by Caroline's social circle. He was too serious, too bookish, too interested in literature and politics and not interested enough in the social games that Caroline played so well. He felt slighted, underappreciated, resentful of the aunt who treated him as somehow lesser despite his enormous wealth. In 1891, he did something shocking. He renounced his American citizenship and moved to England, where he would eventually buy a castle, become a British citizen, and secure aristocratic titles for his sons. But before he left America, he wanted revenge on the aunt who had never truly accepted him. And he owned the perfect weapon. The property directly next to Caroline's mansion on Fifth Avenue. On that property, William Waldorf Astor built something designed specifically to drive Caroline away. Not another mansion, not a competing palace, a hotel, the Waldorf Hotel, and not just any hotel. The most luxurious, most expensive, most visible hotel in New York. A building that would bring strangers past Caroline's windows every single day. Imagine waking up every morning to find carriages pulling up next door at all hours, doormen shouting for cabs, guests arriving and departing, delivery wagons unloading supplies, the smell of kitchen grease and cigar smoke drifting through your curtains, the noise of a commercial establishment operating right beside your private residence. For Caroline Astor, who valued privacy and exclusivity above almost everything else, it was an unbearable insult. She could have fought back legally. She could have used her influence to block the hotel's construction. But by the time she fully understood what William Waldorf was doing, it was too late. The hotel opened in 1893, and it was an immediate success. It was spectacular. 13 stories tall, 500 rooms, electric lights throughout, its own power plant, a dining room that could seat 1,500 people, and a palm garden that became the most fashionable place in New York to be seen. The message was clear. William Waldorf had beaten Caroline at her own game. He had taken the most exclusive address in New York and turned it into a public space. He had forced the queen of society to live next door to a hotel. The humiliation was calculated and devastating. But Caroline Astor was too proud to appear defeated. She would not give William Waldorf the satisfaction of seeing her retreat in disgrace. Instead, she announced plans for a new mansion that would make the old brownstone look like a cottage by comparison. Something that would dwarf the Waldorf Hotel. Something that would remind all of New York exactly who ruled this city and who would rule it for generations to come. She chose a plot further north, at 840 and 841 Fifth Avenue, between 64th and 65th Streets. This was where the city's new wealth was building their own palaces. The Vanderbilts were already there. The Whitneys. The Fricks. Fifth Avenue above 50th Street was becoming Millionaire's Row, and Caroline Astor would have the finest palace of them all. She hired the greatest architect in America to design it, Richard Morris Hunt, a man who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and brought European grandeur to American shores. Hunt had already designed the Vanderbilt mansions, including the Breakers in Newport. He had designed the Great Hall at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He had designed the administration building for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And he had designed the base of the Statue of Liberty itself. If anyone could create a palace worthy of Caroline Astor, it was Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt gave Caroline exactly what she wanted, a French Renaissance palace inspired by the grand chateau of the Loire Valley, specifically the Château de Blois, where French kings Louis XII and Francis I had held court. The style was deliberately royal. The message was unmistakable. Caroline Astor might live in a republic, but she intended to live like a queen. The design was actually two separate mansions joined together, designed to function either independently or as a single grand residence. Caroline would occupy 841 Fifth Avenue, the northern half of the double mansion. Her son John Jacob Astor IV would occupy 840, the southern half. Each half had its own entrance, its own service areas, its own private spaces. But they shared the grandest public spaces, including a ballroom that was 4 times larger than the one at 350 Fifth Avenue. This new ballroom could accommodate 1,200 guests without anyone feeling crowded. Construction began in 1894. The scale of the project was staggering. Marble was imported from Italy for the staircases. Oak paneling was carved in France and shipped to New York. Ceilings were painted and gilded by master craftsmen. Crystal chandeliers were commissioned from European workshops. Every detail was meant to impress. Every room was designed to overwhelm. This was not just a house. It was a statement of power. It took 2 years to complete. 2 years of construction crews working 6 days a week. 2 years of Caroline supervising every detail, approving every design choice, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. And when it finally opened in 1896, it was everything she had dreamed and more. 52 rooms spread across multiple floors, a grand entrance hall with soaring ceilings, the massive ballroom with its gilded moldings and crystal chandeliers, capable of holding 1,200 guests in comfort, a music room, a library, multiple drawing rooms, private suites for family and guests, and everywhere, the finest materials money could buy. Silk wallpaper, Persian rugs, old master paintings, sculpture from Europe, furniture that had once belonged to French aristocrats. The mansion required a staff of dozens just to maintain. Maids to clean the endless rooms, footmen to answer doors, a butler to manage the household, cooks and kitchen staff to prepare elaborate dinners, gardeners for the grounds, maintenance workers for the heating system and the newfangled electric lights and the plumbing. The operating costs were astronomical, but Caroline did not care. This was her palace, her throne room, her final decisive victory over William Waldorf Astor and anyone else who thought they could challenge her supremacy. And in a delicious irony, her son John Jacob IV took the family's revenge even further. He built his own hotel, the Astoria, right next to William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel. And eventually, the two rival hotels merged to become the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most famous hotels in the world. The family feud became a hyphen. The battleground became a monument. And the Astor name was permanently associated with luxury and grandeur, exactly as Caroline had intended. But the new mansion on Fifth Avenue was more than a building. It was a declaration that Caroline Astor was not just wealthy, she was royalty. She was untouchable. And this palace, built with marble and gold and the finest craftsmanship Europe could provide, was the physical proof of everything the family had accomplished. It was meant to last for centuries. A monument to Astor power that would stand long after Caroline herself was gone. No one could have predicted it would barely survive 30 years. In February 1911, Caroline's son John Jacob threw a housewarming party that stunned even jaded New York society. 208 guests received engraved invitations. The mansion had recently been renovated to unite the two halves into one grand residence, because Caroline was gone now, dead for more than 2 years, and John Jacob needed space befitting his status as not just an Astor, but as the richest man in New York. The party was his way of announcing that the Astor dynasty was stronger than ever, that the mansion would continue to be the center of New York society, that the next generation was ready to carry on the family legacy. But there was a complication that made the party far more scandalous than Caroline would ever have allowed. John Jacob Astor IV was 46 years old, recently divorced from his first wife Ava, and newly remarried to a woman who shocked society even more than his wealth impressed them. Her name was Madeleine Force, and she was 18 years old, younger than John Jacob's son Vincent from his first marriage. The age gap was not just significant, it was scandalous. It was, in the eyes of New York society, obscene. The scandal had been immediate and vicious. Newspapers called him a cradle robber. Editorial writers questioned his morality. Society matrons whispered that no decent woman would have him, and that Madeleine could only be after his money. Some papers published cartoons showing an old man with a schoolgirl. Others compared him to European aristocrats who preyed on young girls. The gossip was relentless and cruel. His own mother, Caroline, had she lived to see the wedding, would have been mortified. She had spent decades building the Astor name into something respectable. She had made their family the arbiter of good taste and proper behavior. And now her son was making them the subject of tabloid ridicule. But John Jacob Astor IV did not care what society thought. And perhaps he had earned the right not to care. He had been a dutiful son for 46 years. He had married the woman his family approved of, Ava Lowell Willing, a Philadelphia socialite from an old family. They had 2 children together, Vincent and Ava. But the marriage had been cold, loveless, a social arrangement that satisfied his mother's expectations but left him personally miserable. He had served his country with distinction. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, he had outfitted an artillery unit at his own expense and led it into battle. He had earned the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had proven himself brave under fire. He had come home a decorated war hero. He had been a successful businessman in his own right, not just living off the family fortune, but actively building it. He had built the Astoria Hotel in 1897, a massive structure with 500 rooms that competed directly with his cousin William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel. The 2 rival hotels eventually merged in 1929 to create the Waldorf Astoria, still one of the most famous hotels in the world. He had built the St. Regis Hotel in 1904, another luxury property that catered to the richest and most discerning travelers. He had invested in real estate across Manhattan, following his great-grandfather's philosophy of buying and holding land. He had even written a science fiction novel, A Journey in Other Worlds, published in 1894, imagined the year 2000, with predictions about air travel, solar energy, and space exploration. It was not great literature, but it showed an inventive mind, a man who thought about the future and tried to imagine what it might hold. So when John Jacob Astor divorced Ava in 1909 and fell in love with Madeleine Force, the teenage daughter of a Brooklyn manufacturer, he felt he had earned the right to marry for love rather than social approval. Society could judge all it wanted. The newspapers could mock. The matrons could gossip. He was 46 years old, wealthy beyond measure, accomplished in business and war, and he was going to marry the woman he loved. The wedding took place on September 11th, 1911, in the ballroom of Beechwood, the Astor family estate in Newport, Rhode Island. It was a small ceremony by Astor standards. Only family and close friends attended. There was no grand society reception, no announcement in the newspapers, no attempt to win society's approval. John Jacob knew he would not get it, so he did not ask for it. Instead, he and Madeleine left for an extended honeymoon in Europe and Egypt. They would stay abroad for months, he decided, long enough for the scandal to fade, long enough for New York society to find something else to gossip about. long enough for Madeline to enjoy her first months of marriage without being subjected to the cruel stares and whispers that would follow her everywhere in New York. But the scandal did not fade. It grew worse. Everywhere they went, gossip followed. American tourists in Paris whispered and pointed. European newspapers published stories about the scandalous American millionaire and his child bride. Reporters tracked their movements from city to city. Strangers felt entitled to approach them and offer unsolicited opinions about their marriage. By the spring of 1912, Madeline was 5 months pregnant. The travel was becoming difficult, the constant attention was exhausting, and John Jacob decided it was time to go home. His wife needed to be in New York, in their mansion, in the care of proper doctors, before the baby arrived. They needed to be in familiar surroundings, with family nearby, ready to welcome the next generation of Astors. On April 10, 1912, they boarded a ship in Southampton, England. The ship was the RMS Titanic, on its maiden voyage to New York, the largest moving object ever built by human hands, the most luxurious vessel ever to sail the seas, 882 feet long, 92 feet wide, weighing 46,000 tons, 9 decks, 3 million rivets holding it together. It could carry more than 3,000 passengers and crew, and according to everyone who mattered, according to the shipbuilders and the engineers and the company that owned it, the Titanic was utterly unsinkable. The White Star Line had spared no expense. The first-class accommodations were more luxurious than any hotel on land. There was a grand staircase with oak paneling and a wrought iron clock, a swimming pool, a gymnasium with the latest exercise equipment, Turkish baths, a squash court, multiple dining rooms serving French cuisine prepared by chefs hired from the finest restaurants in Europe. For the wealthiest passengers, there were private promenade decks, personal servants, suites larger than most people's homes. John Jacob Astor booked the finest accommodations available. He traveled with Madeline, their servants, and even their Airedale terrier named Kitty. He was the richest passenger on the ship, and possibly the richest passenger ever to sail on any ship. His net worth of $87 million exceeded the combined wealth of most other first-class passengers. The voyage started perfectly. The weather was calm. The ship was smooth. Madeline was feeling better after months of difficult pregnancy-related illness. John Jacob brought her on deck to admire the ship's grandeur. They walked the first-class promenade together. They dined in the elegant restaurants. They met other wealthy passengers, including Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss, and Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. John Jacob was in high spirits. The scandal of his marriage was behind him. They were going home to New York. His wife was pregnant with his son. The future looked bright. The Titanic was exactly the kind of achievement he appreciated. Modern, bold, engineered to perfection with the latest technology. Just like the hotels he built. Just like the mansion waiting for them on Fifth Avenue. Proof that wealth and engineering could overcome any obstacle. 4 days into the voyage, on the evening of April 14th, 1912, the ship was steaming through the North Atlantic at nearly top speed. Captain Edward Smith wanted to arrive in New York on schedule, maybe even early, to demonstrate the ship's capabilities. The ocean was calm. The night was clear. The stars were brilliant in a moonless sky. Some passengers later said it was the most beautiful night they had ever seen at sea. At 11:40 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something ahead. Something massive. Something white. An iceberg directly in the ship's path. He rang the warning bell 3 times. He telephoned the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch immediately ordered the engines reversed, and the ship turned hard to port. For 37 seconds, the Titanic turned. It almost worked. Almost. The bow cleared the iceberg, but the side of the ship scraped against the ice below the waterline. A series of small punctures and tears opened up across 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. The ship could survive 4 compartments flooding, not 6. At first, most passengers did not understand the danger. The impact had felt minor, a scraping sound, a slight shudder. Some ice fell onto the forward deck. Nothing that suggested catastrophe. Many passengers were asleep and never even felt it. Those who were awake went on deck out of curiosity more than concern. John Jacob Astor was one of those who went to investigate. He walked to the forward deck, saw chunks of ice scattered there, and even picked up a piece to bring back to his suite. He showed it to Madeline with a smile. A souvenir, he told her. Something to remember their voyage. Everything was fine. The ship was unsinkable. They would be in New York in 2 days, and this would just be an amusing story to tell at dinner parties. But down below, in the bowels of the ship, water was pouring in at an unstoppable rate. The pumps could not keep up. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who was aboard for the maiden voyage, inspected the damage and delivered his verdict to Captain Smith. The ship would sink in less than 2 hours. There was no way to save it. At 12:15 a.m., 45 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats prepared. Women and children first. The crew began their work, but there was a problem. A terrible, fatal problem. The Titanic had lifeboats for only 1,178 people. There were more than 2,000 people aboard. Even if every lifeboat was filled to capacity, hundreds would be left behind. And the crew did not fill the lifeboats to capacity. They were undertrained, uncertain. Some officers worried that the lifeboats would collapse if filled completely. They loaded them half full. A boat designed for 65 people left with 28. Another designed for 40 left with 12. Precious spaces remained empty while hundreds of people stood on deck waiting for rescue. At 1:25 a.m., John Jacob helped Madeline into her life vest. The situation was serious now. The deck was tilting noticeably. The crew was frantically loading lifeboats. Other passengers were pushing and shoving, panicking as they realized what was happening. But John Jacob remained calm. He walked his pregnant 18-year-old wife to the boat deck on the port side, where Lifeboat 4 was being prepared. The scene was chaos. Women crying, children screaming, men arguing with officers. The ship's band was playing music, trying to keep everyone calm. Second Officer Charles Littler was supervising the loading of Lifeboat 4, enforcing the women and children first policy with rigid determination. John Jacob helped Madeline into the lifeboat. He made sure she was seated, made sure she was wrapped in blankets against the freezing air. Then he asked Second Officer Littler a question. A reasonable question. Could he join her, given her delicate condition? She was 18. She was 5 months pregnant. She was terrified. Littler's response was firm, uncompromising. No, sir. No man is allowed on this boat until the ladies are off. John Jacob did not argue. He did not pull rank. He did not offer money. He did not use his name or his wealth or his influence. He simply asked which lifeboat number she was in, so he could find her afterwards. Lifeboat 4, the officer told him. Then John Jacob Astor stepped back from the boat, back into the crowd of doomed men. Madeline watched him light a cigarette. Calm, composed, the richest man in the world, standing on the deck of a sinking ship, waiting for death with the same quiet dignity he had brought to everything in his life. That was the last time she ever saw him. Lifeboat 4 was lowered at 1:55 a.m. Madeleine sat in the boat, 5 months pregnant, wrapped in blankets, watching the Titanic's lights glow against the black ocean. She could still hear the band playing. She could see figures moving on the deck. Somewhere up there, her husband was waiting for a miracle that would not come. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the Titanic broke in half and sank. 1,500 people went into the water. John Jacob Astor IV was among them. His body was recovered a week later by the ship Mackay Bennett. He was identified by the initials sewn into his jacket. In his pockets, they found a gold watch, still ticking despite the icy water, a fortune in jewelry, and keys to the mansion on Fifth Avenue that he would never see again. Madeleine Astor sat in that lifeboat for hours in the freezing darkness, surrounded by the screams of the dying. She was rescued the next morning by the ship Carpathia. She returned to New York a widow at 18, pregnant with the son of the richest man in America. 4 months later, on August 14, 1912, she gave birth to John Jacob Astor VI, a boy who would never know his father, an heir born into a dynasty that was already beginning to crumble. The will was read. John Jacob had left the bulk of his $85 million fortune to his older son Vincent. $69 million. Madeleine received a $5 million trust fund, but there was a condition. If she remarried, she would lose access to the Astor properties. She would keep the trust money, but the mansion, the estates, the family name would no longer be hers. Vincent Astor was 20 years old when he inherited. A Harvard student who suddenly found himself responsible for managing the largest real estate empire in New York. He had lost his father in the most famous tragedy of the age. He had inherited a fortune worth billions in today's money, and he had a half-brother, baby John Jacob VI, who society would always compare to him. But Vincent had a more immediate problem. The mansion, the palace his grandmother Caroline had built, the symbol of Astor power, it was now his burden. Maintaining it required a full-time staff of dozens. The heating bills alone were staggering. The taxes were crushing, and Vincent had no desire to live in a museum dedicated to his grandmother's memory. He tried. For a while he kept the mansion as it was. He walked the same marble halls his grandmother had walked. He slept in rooms his father had known. But the place felt empty, haunted. Too many ghosts, too much history, and entirely too expensive for a young man who had other priorities. Meanwhile, Madeleine faced her own impossible choice. She was 22 years old, a widow, a mother, and completely dependent on a trust fund that required her to remain unmarried forever. For 4 years, she honored the conditions, but in 1916, she fell in love again. William K. Dick, a childhood friend. She married him, and the moment she did, she lost everything. The mansion, the properties, even the right to call herself Mrs. Astor. Vincent could have fought the loss of the mansion, but he chose not to. In 1926, 14 years after his father's death, he made a decision that shocked even cynical New York society. He sold the mansion, all of it, the palace his grandmother had built, the symbol of Astor supremacy, the physical proof of everything the family had accomplished. Before the sale, he had one room carefully dismantled, his father's bedroom, every panel, every piece of molding, every fixture. He had it removed and reinstalled in a townhouse at 130 East 80th Street, a tribute to the father he barely remembered, a memorial to a man who died in the freezing Atlantic while Vincent slept safely at Harvard. The rest of the mansion was sold to Benjamin Winter Sr. The contents were auctioned by the American Art Association. Strangers walked through Caroline's ballroom and bid on her furniture, her paintings, her china. Everything that had once been sacred to New York's most exclusive circle was now for sale to the highest bidder. And then the wrecking crews arrived. The demolition took months. Marble staircases that had been imported from France were smashed to rubble. Gilded ceilings that had taken master craftsmen years to create were torn down in hours. The ballroom that had held 1,200 guests was reduced to a pile of debris. In one photograph from that demolition, 2 small children sit in an abandoned marble bathtub, playing amid the ruins. They had no idea they were sitting in the wreckage of American aristocracy. The site was purchased by Congregation Emmanuel, one of the oldest and wealthiest Jewish congregations in New York. They announced plans to build a new temple on the exact spot where the Astor mansion once stood. The contrast was impossible to miss. The family that had defined Christian New York society was being replaced by a faith they had never fully accepted into their social circle. Old money was giving way to new priorities. The mansion of earthly power was becoming a house of worship. Temple Emmanuel was completed in 1929. It remains one of the largest synagogues in the world. Its sanctuary can hold 2,500 people. Its architecture is stunning, and beneath its floors lie the foundations of the Astor mansion, buried but not forgotten. But what happened to the fortune? Vincent Astor lived until 1959. He never had children. He married 3 times. His third wife was a woman named Brooke Astor, a socialite who would become more famous than any Astor before her. When Vincent died, he left his entire fortune to Brooke, not to his half-brother Jakey, not to distant relatives. Everything went to Brooke, $67 million. And Brooke did something the Astors had never done before. She gave it away. She spent the next 48 years distributing the Astor fortune to New York City charities, libraries, parks, museums, schools. The money that John Jacob I had made buying Manhattan was now being given back to Manhattan. The fortune that had built palaces was now building playgrounds. Jakey, the posthumous son born to Madeline 4 months after the Titanic sank, sued for his share of the estate. He settled for $250,000, a fraction of what Vincent had inherited. A reminder that even among Astors, birth order and timing mattered more than blood. John Jacob I had died the richest man in America. John Jacob IV had died the richest man on the Titanic. Their descendants ended up with almost nothing. The mansion was gone. The hotels were sold. The land was divided. The only thing that remained was the name. And even that became more famous for philanthropy than power. Caroline Astor, the woman who had built the mansion and ruled society from its ballroom, never lived to see any of it. She died in 1908, 4 years before the Titanic sank. But her final years were not the triumphant twilight of a queen. They were a slow descent into darkness that foreshadowed everything that would follow. In 1908, Caroline fell down the mansion's marble staircase, the same staircase she had descended countless times in perfect composure, diamonds glittering, guests bowing as she passed. This time, she fell. She struck her head. The injury should have been minor, but something changed after that fall. Her mind began to slip. Doctors at the time called it periodic dementia. Modern physicians might recognize it as traumatic brain injury or Alzheimer's disease. But whatever the medical term, the result was heartbreaking. Caroline's mind retreated into the past. She planned dinners for guests who never arrived. She ordered servants to prepare for balls that would never happen. According to some accounts, she believed she was pregnant and demanded the nursery be readied for a baby that did not exist. The woman who had defined social order with ruthless precision now wandered the mansion's halls in confusion, trapped in memories of a world that no longer existed. Her daughter Carrie was the only family member with her when she died on October 30th, 1908. The official cause was heart palpitations, but the truth was simpler and sadder. The Queen of New York society had lost her throne to time and her own failing mind. 4 years later, her son would lose his life to cold water and bad luck. 14 years after that, her mansion would lose its walls to progress and economic reality. The dynasty she had worked so hard to elevate ended not with a bang, but with a series of quiet defeats, a fall downstairs, a sinking ship, a wrecking ball. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Caroline planned parties for ghosts. John Jacob built mansions and hotels he believed would stand forever. Vincent inherited a fortune he could not sustain. Madeleine lost everything for the crime of wanting love twice. Jakey fought for scraps of an inheritance that should have been his birthright, and the mansion itself, the physical embodiment of Astor power, lasted only 30 years. 30 years from construction to demolition. 30 years from triumph to rubble. The same amount of time that separated the first John Jacob's arrival in America from his first $1 million. History moves in circles, and the Astors learned that lesson the hard way. Today, if you visit the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street, you will find Temple Emmanuel standing where the Astor Mansion once ruled. There is no plaque marking the site. No memorial to Caroline or John Jacob IV, no acknowledgement that this was once the center of American social power. The temple's congregation prays and studies and celebrates, unaware that beneath their feet lie the foundations of a dynasty that believed it would last forever. The Titanic connection makes the story irresistible. The richest man on the most famous ship, dying in the most famous tragedy. But the real tragedy was not John Jacob's death in the Atlantic. It was the slow realization that his fortune, his name, his legacy could not survive the 20th century. Old money does not guarantee permanence. Mansions built of marble still crumble. Dynasties founded on land still end. Brooke Astor understood this in a way the earlier generations never could. She knew the Astor name had become synonymous with greed and excess. She knew the mansion's demolition had been a public humiliation. She knew that holding on to the fortune would only invite more resentment. So she let it go. She transformed the Astor legacy from one of acquisition to one of generosity. She gave away what could not be kept. And in doing so, she saved the family name. When Brooke died in 2007 at age 105, she was mourned as a saint of New York philanthropy. Her funeral was attended by mayors and millionaires and ordinary citizens who had benefited from her gifts. She had taken a fortune built on ruthless accumulation and turned it into something beautiful. The New York Public Library, Central Park, the Metropolitan Museum, the Bronx Zoo. All of them carry the Astor name today, not because of mansions or hotels, but because Brooke chose to share what Vincent had left her. The watch that was recovered from John Jacob Astor's body after the Titanic sank became Vincent's most treasured possession. He wore it for the rest of his life. That watch had stopped ticking in the icy Atlantic at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. But Vincent had it repaired. He kept it running. A reminder that time continues even after tragedy, that life goes on even when fortune fails. In a way, that watch tells the entire story. The Astors built an empire that seemed eternal, but time, like water, erodes everything eventually. The mansion is gone, the fortune is scattered, the dynasty ended. What remains is a synagogue, a few charitable foundations, and a name that once meant power but now means something quieter. Legacy. Caroline Astor wanted to be remembered as the queen of society. John Jacob Astor wanted to be remembered as the richest man in America. Vincent Astor wanted to escape his family's shadow. Madeline just wanted to be allowed to love again. Jakey wanted his fair share, and in the end, none of them got exactly what they wanted. But Brooke, the outsider who married into the family, gave them something better. She gave them redemption. The mansion that once stood at 840 and 841 Fifth Avenue was designed to last centuries. It lasted 3 decades. The fortune that built it was supposed to grow forever. It was given away in a lifetime. The dynasty that defined Gilded Age New York was supposed to endure for generations. It ended with a woman who understood that the only wealth worth keeping is the wealth you give away. And so the Astor story ends not with wrecking balls and auction houses, but with parks and libraries and museums. Not with a mansion, but with a temple. Not with the Titanic drowning a fortune, but with that fortune finally finding a purpose beyond accumulation. The children playing in the marble bathtub amid the mansion's ruins in 1926 could not have known they were sitting at the end of an era. But we can look back now and see the truth. The greatest houses fall. The richest men drown. The most powerful dynasties fade. What survives is not the marble or the money, but the choice to build something that outlasts your own ambition. Caroline Astor's mansion is gone, but Temple Emmanuel still stands. John Jacob's fortune is scattered, but the libraries Brooke funded still serve millions. The dynasty drowned, but the legacy, transformed by tragedy and generosity, somehow survived. That is the real story of the Astor Mansion. Not how it was built, but how it was lost. And not how it was lost, but what rose in its place.